I've wanted to discuss transsexual soldiers for a while now. Originally, I had wanted to discuss all this unscripted and from the heart, but as time went on, I realized the necessity to properly document and articulate my thoughts. The events of the past week have shown a lot of things about a lot of people on the subject. Some have been positive, but most have been negative. Nothing like political discourse to bring the best out in people, right? In any event, I'd like to provide my argument and background to the whole transsexual soldier argument. This is likely going to be a longer video, so strap yourselves in. But first, I'd like to establish my ethos on the subject. I've wanted to be a soldier since I was 8 years old. My personal hero and source of inspiration came from my grandfather, and I admired just about everything about him growing up. He was calm, stoic, empathetic, and endlessly patient. He was also hardworking, self-sacrificing, and he put his family first above anything else that he did. He was the sort of person that just didn't ask of others, but would give himself in just about everything that he did. Selfless and patient. When he made a decision, he kept by it, and I'll never forget the day he chose to stop smoking. He had smoked regularly for well on 50 years, until randomly one afternoon, he had decided he'd had enough. He put the cigarettes down and never touched them again. That's the kind of guy he was. Unfortunately, though, it would prove too little too late, as he died of throat cancer several years later. My grandfather was also a veteran of the Second World War. His tour of duty sent him all over Europe during the war, and he fought bravely in a number of famous battles. Not only did he land several days after the initial D-Day invasion, but he would go on to fight at the Battle of the Bulge. He said it was so cold and snowy that the snow reached up past his waist, and unfortunately he saw several of his squad mates killed during the fighting. Later, he would wait for the Russians to cross the Rhine, and even got to meet General George S. Patton, whom he called an insufferable son of a bitch. He was, in every definition of the word, a hero, both to me and to the country whom he served. My grandfather made me realize the value of sacrifice, determination, and service he provided to his family and to his country. He made me understand the high cost of freedom and made me appreciate the sacrifice that goes into military service. He was my role model, and I wanted to emulate his sacrifice and his service by one day becoming an officer in the United States military. There was only one problem. I was 6 years old when I began to exhibit signs of sexual dysphoria as a transsexual. My life was split between wanting to be a soldier and attempting to seek treatment. Even though my family was incredibly anti-military, I secretly hoped to join the ROTC in college, or apply on as a soldier once I graduated. But again, this posed a problem. See, this was during the don't ask, don't tell years. When I finally did arrive in college about 12 years ago, I had to make a choice. Either seek out treatment for transsexuality or join the military at a significant risk of being discharged under don't ask, don't tell. After much consideration, I chose the path of treatment and put that childhood dream to rest. But dreams have a strange ability to not die quite so easily. In 2012, when President Obama repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act, I was ecstatic. I felt as though I had another chance at pursuing my life dream, and I could barely contain my excitement. There was still hope, after all. I excitedly went to a recruiter, only to discover that while gays and lesbians were allowed military service, transsexuals were still barred. It especially didn't help that I was pre-op at the time. It was this realization that caused me to return to school to study law enforcement. My reasoning was that if I couldn't have a lieutenancy as a soldier, I could still get one as a police officer. Unfortunately, the cost of tuition and my career got in the way, and I stopped about a semester short of graduation. Fun fact though, if I finished that semester and get tested by the state, I'd have the same credentials to be a police officer. Nevertheless, the dream revived again in 2015 when then Secretary of Defense Ash Carter announced the possibility of allowing transsexuals to serve openly. A year later, in 2016, they announced transsexuals would finally, after all this time, be able to enter service beginning on July 1st, 2017. I had waited almost 6 years by this point. I wrote to the Department of Defense, the Secretary of the Air Force, and then to President Obama, announcing my interest and eagerness to serve, if only they would have me. I got in touch with an Air Force officer recruiter and discussed the possibilities with him for nearly 2 years. I spent nearly 18 months exercising with a strict running routine. At my best, I was going about 40 miles per week, and I dropped about 50 pounds. I studied for the AFO-QT test and even the ASVAB test, or ASVAB test, which is for enlisted soldiers, just so I'd be able to boost my entry score the higher. As the months wound down, I added push-ups and sit-ups to my exercise regimen, and I got my affairs in order. I put together my medical history, acquired copies of my degree and birth certificate, and I even had former employers write me letters of recommendation. Finally, at 12 midnight on January 1st, 2017, when the door opened, I sent my intent to begin the formal process to join to my Air Force officer recruiter. It was only later that day that I found General Mattis had decided to delay entry about 6 months. And then, of course, it was President Trump that announced the ban. And it's here that my dream has officially died. The reason I'm providing all this backstory is to provide in no small terms just how devoted I was to becoming a soldier. It was a lifelong dream and ambition, and I wanted nothing more than the opportunity to serve my country. So after having gotten all of that out of the way, I have to say this. I support President Trump's decision. I can recognize, no matter my own desires, that this decision, as the president described, was one on cost. As deeply disappointed as I am to see this dream finally die, I can appreciate the reasoning behind the decision. I can even support it. The issue, as I will explain, is not one of civil liberties. The issue is not, can the military make accommodations for transsexual soldiers? The issue is ultimately, at what cost? Does allowing for transsexual soldiers benefit the military and the soldiers sufficiently to cover the cost, both material and immaterial? It does not. And I also believe that ignoring it would result in greater financial costs, less efficiency, and more dead soldiers. None of these things I think can be justified to the United States Armed Forces that has been so thoroughly abused over the past 20 years from both the Bush and Obama administrations. In short, our soldiers deserve better. To that end, I would like to address a number of the arguments put forward and discuss them as best as I can. This analysis is in no way exhaustive, but simply the opinions of a transsexual hopeful from my own research. So having said that, let's examine the financial cost of allowing transsexuals to serve. The first thing we need to figure out is numbers. How many transsexuals are actually serving in the military? I've seen everything from the Human Rights Campaign saying 15,000 to Gavin McInnes claiming he could only find one. The answer from what I can tell is that nobody really knows. Most numbers are often extrapolated using various data sources and statistical extrapolations. However, I did find a good source on this on an assessment report by the RAND Corporation. This particular report was sponsored by, and I'm quoting here, by the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness and conducted within the Forces and Resources Policy Center of the RAND National Defense Research Institute, a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the Office of the Secretary of Defense. You can find this report online, and I will leave a link in the description below. According to this report, exact numbers vary depending on the sources of data given, but the numbers they do have are anywhere between 1,320 to 6,630 in active duty and 830 to 4,160 in reserve duty. It should also be noted that the higher end counts were determined using data from places like Massachusetts and California, where the number of transsexuals are thought to be higher than normal. But even with that estimate, the range is thought to be approximately 2,000 to about 10,000 soldiers out of a force of 2.08 million when you combine both active and reserve forces. That's about 0.00096% or 0.0048% of the total military population. Surely the military can make accommodations for such a small number, right? The short answer is yes. But the long answer becomes muddier and more uncertain. The same report reveals something else quite telling. According to the VA, the number of gender dysphoria diagnoses and subsequent treatment has been rapidly increasing in recent years. From 2006 to 2013, a full 2 years before the Department of Defense allowed for transsexual soldiers to openly serve and receive health care, the rate of diagnoses almost doubled. This means the prevalence rate jumped nearly 10 times from 2006 to 2013. Is this a sign that the number of transsexuals seeking treatment is likely to increase, perhaps even dramatically? The answer, I believe, is yes. Before I could get to specific dollar amounts, first consider what opening the door for medical treatment for transsexuals could actually mean. Unlike most of Western Europe, the United States lacks a universal healthcare system that allows for low-cost treatment of gender dysphoria. By opening the door and allowing for medical treatment, what's essentially to stop a trans person who has very little interest in the military from joining solely for the medical care to treat their gender dysphoria. Without specific guidelines and with anti-discrimination policies in place, the military could be burdened with unsuitable candidates that they're required to treat and cannot use. Given the accelerated number of gender dysphoria treatments from the VA, I believe the military could be exploited for access to medical coverage. Don't get me wrong, healthcare is certainly an important political and social issue for our time. I'm not suggesting that these transsexuals don't deserve coverage. But the military does not deserve to be placed in a position where enlistment and service could be abused for medication and surgeries. But then again, what would it actually cost? Again, with a population between about 2,000 to 10,000 soldiers, how many transsexuals are seeking treatment and what is the exact dollar figure it would cost? According to the RAND report, estimates vary, but it's estimated that between 60 to 300 soldiers per year would be interested in transitioning. The numbers are even lower when seeking hormone or surgical treatment. So what's the bottom line and what would it cost? According to this report, the low-end cost estimate for these transitions would cost approximately $2.4 million, while the upper bound cost is about $8 million or so. That's a tiny drop in the bucket when you realize the entire healthcare cost is about $6.2 billion, right? Quite the bargain. Especially when the military is wasting all those millions on Viagra, right? I'd like to take a moment to dispel this Viagra story, since it's often brought out to justify the cost of transitioning and imply gross military waste. I'll get to the additional hidden costs of transsexual soldiers in a moment, but do you know why the military spends money on Viagra? According to this report released by the VA, male combat veterans suffering from PTSD have an erectile dysfunction rate of approximately 85 to 90%. Yes, that means trauma from combat is so severe that nearly all combat veterans with PTSD suffer from it. Sexual dysfunction from combat PTSD is not just limited to men either. Other reports indicate that women who have combat PTSD are becoming infertile. Think about that for a minute. Given all the scandals with the VA in recent years, people are actually suggesting to stop payment or reduce payment of Viagra to veterans with PTSD, as if we didn't treat our veterans poorly enough as it is. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, this treatment cost estimate is very misleading. The cost lost in time, accommodations, retooling bases, equipment, and a million other factors are not included in that cost. For example, did you know that if you're a woman wanting to join the Navy or Coast Guard, that you have to score higher than your male counterparts on the ASVAB to serve on a submarine or naval vessel? That's because female accommodations on these vessels are fewer, despite women being able to openly serve. Let's pretend for a moment that you're a transsexual who comes out aboard a Navy vessel. What accommodations do you use as pre-op and pre-treatment? Do you stay in your old bunk, or are you shifted somewhere else? Given the onboard doctor or psychologist doesn't have gender dysphoria as a specialty field, how do they treat you when you're on board? The law protects you from discrimination, so would that mean the entire vessel has to route back to a base so it can treat you? What would that cost, both in fiscal and strategic resources? Or what about basic training? What if you decide to come out while you begin? Are you shuffled to the new barracks despite you being entirely pre-op? Do you go out of training until you begin transitioning? Or maybe you go to a third barracks for transsexuals only. What would those accommodations cost? And each branch has its own recruitment and training facilities. What too if you're pre-op but transitioning and decide to enter? Would the military require you to get surgery or treatment before you could begin training? Would it need to accommodate you at a base where it had a specialist doctor who could do this? And what would that cost? Those are only just two minor scenarios, and the additional costs associated with the mere act of treatment alone would be drastically higher than they would be in civilian life. Then again, what would the studies themselves cost to determine what coverage costs the military would have in order to remain compliant and within transsexual anti-discrimination policies? And where would the additional resources be coming from? Given that neither the officer nor the enlisted recruiters could even tell me what physical graduation standards I would use, it seems as though there are many unknowns and very few distinct answers. And then there's the revelation that treatment can lead to permanent healthcare costs after the initial investment. According to the RAND report, approximately 3 to 11 surgeries per year would result in long-term disability from gender reassignment surgery. This would mean they would require additional VA benefits with further complications affecting their ability to do their military job. The report also indicates that anywhere from 6 to 20% of male-to-female surgeries result in complications, while complications from female-to-male surgeries can be as high as 25%. Then there's the potential costs of further health complications that can result from hormone therapy treatment alone. For example, I had regular checkups with my hormone prescribing doctors, since hormone treatment could also create blood clots. I also need my daily estrogen pill even after surgery because I don't produce the hormones I used to, which can affect my bone density and lead to osteoporosis if I don't take them. Then there's the revelation that the transsexual population has an inflated tendency towards suicide, regardless of cost of treatment. What would these additional services cost the military if they were used? And then there's opportunity cost. It costs approximately $6 million to train a fighter pilot, for example. This means a transsexual pilot's training program is more expensive, which in the end results in fewer pilots trained on the same budget. And what of the additional cost of lost time? The Army, for example, requires at least 6 weeks of recovery after surgery before deployment. The following charts show the number of days required in time off before a soldier can return to service. While the report states that the lost man-hours would be negligible when compared to the entirety of the armed forces, it does not provide a feasibility report to the loss of functionality to an individual unit or company. And that statement there is a good transition, pardon the pun, to get into the cost of reduced functionality, efficiency, and unit cohesion. As a civilian, I'm able to take off time from work without it affecting too much of my work life. I have a private life of my own, and while I work as a team with my job, it's not absolutely critical if I miss a large amount of time away. In the military, it's a different story. See, in the military, you're part of a group, and you work together as a team. In civilian life, if I have an issue, I could speak to human resources, transfer positions, find a new job, or leave the country altogether and do something new. In the armed forces, you have fewer options, and disagreements between people can result in a lack of cohesion that can get people killed. I'm sure a lot of people have anecdotal stories about soldiers that don't do their job, of the one guy in their squad who gets everyone else in trouble or causes problems they have to fix. The reason I bring this up is because a lack of unit cohesion can and does get people killed. Your job performance just isn't how well you perform, but how strongly you fit into your job group, whether it's an infantry squad, a tank crew, an accounting staff, or an IT team. And it's also worth noting here that it doesn't really matter how well you like one another. A longitudinal report by the Marine Corps revealed that nearly 80% of mixed units of male and female soldiers during combat simulations had lower functionality, more injuries, and worse accuracy or effectiveness over units of male-only soldiers. Even if the units were completely friendly, completely strong, completely together as a team, a woman's biological differences prove to be a liability, not assets to the entire group. Now, before you scream sexism, what I mean by that is that women's musculature and bone structure have less mass and density when compared to men. It wasn't just the female soldier who was at risk, but their entire unit in operation. This sentiment that women should not be in combat units was famously shared by Marine Captain Katie Petronio in 2012 after serving in infantry. Captain Petronio is the woman's woman when it comes to being a Marine. She can bench 150 pounds, is at the peak of physical fitness, a brilliant soldier and former police officer, and possesses the leadership capabilities necessary to lead those under her command in combat. But what she saw in the field were veteran male soldiers whose bones and joints were destroyed under the weight of their rucksacks only after a few years. She saw the grueling physical nature of the position and realized through her own experience, when expectation met reality, women just weren't built for the same kind of tasks that Marines are required to do as infantry. Her conclusion was that these gaps in the unit could result in not only these women getting killed, but would also risk the lives of their fellow soldiers. This is a medical device. It is known as a vaginal dilator. After my sexual reassignment surgery, I'm required to insert this dilator into my, let's call it hot pocket, every day for at least 15 minutes in order to keep it from closing. If I fail to do this, my passageway will close, causing health problems that will require surgery to reopen and correct. While I'm dilating, I'm laying on my back and I'm completely unable to do anything. Furthermore, like I said, my daily estrogen pill helps maintain my endocrine system, which prevents my bones from losing density. The Marines have a phrase, every Marine a rifleman, meaning in wartime, every soldier is infantry. Even if I had a job that was not involved with direct combat, I would be dependent on my medication and the time required to maintain my health. This puts me at a disadvantage, but it would also affect my unit, particularly in wartime and in the field. Imagine the effect on morale if you had a squad mate who got to go inside every day for 15 minutes of privacy, or had the ability to not be deployed overseas because the deployment couldn't guarantee their medication. What long-term effects would I have if I were off my medication for months at a time, lugging around an extremely heavy backpack in a high-stress location like a combat zone? Imagine me as a leader not being present with those under my command because I needed to dilate, or if I were in the field and needed others to protect me while I was dilating on my back. Not only do I think that this would affect our morale, but it would also reduce our effectiveness as a unit. And yes, that can get people killed. Here's another idea. Imagine a military where transsexuals are required to have access to treatment when they come out. You're a soldier facing deployment overseas and have been in a long engagement and just can't take it anymore. Now you have a ready-made excuse to be evaluated for transsexuality and could be prevented from deployment or taken out of the conflict entirely. No doubt, this would be a temptation for abuse, especially if special accommodations for transsexuals are made. How would you separate those who are telling the truth and those who are just deployed for too long? How would transsexuals be viewed in their units? And how would their units perform with this person who said they were trans and needed to leave? What do you think the cultural and morale costs would be over time? And how do you think people would view transsexuals over time? Unfortunately, there are no longitudinal studies about transsexuals and unit cohesion in this regard. There are reports from foreign militaries who have allowed for transsexual soldiers to serve, but comparing these militaries to the United States is often like comparing apples to coconuts. So let me explain. Countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, Israel, and Canada have reported no costs to unit cohesion and morale, but that's not the entire story. The first stark difference is that all of these countries have healthcare systems, meaning the medical cost of transitioning is a lot lower in these countries, and militaries are not the first choice in terms of seeking treatment. Secondly, of the 18 countries that currently allow for transsexual soldiers to serve, only 2 of these countries have been in modern wars that have mobilized the majority of their fighting forces, these 2 countries being Israel and the United Kingdom. Meaning these trans soldiers in these armies haven't been deployed in a combat zone, but in peacetime. The United States has been at war with Iraq and Afghanistan for almost 15 years, and before that, there was Vietnam. Morale studies and unit cohesion reports from these countries just don't translate well to the type of wars the US fights and continues to fight. You don't need to look far in the world to see that we might actually be on deck for another one, be it in Syria or North Korea, maybe over the South China Sea. While the United Kingdom did participate in the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, they didn't mobilize the majority of their fighting force and left before the US did. Additionally, the United Kingdom also emphasizes for transsexuals to be post-op before joining, and they have the NHS. Israel too is an interesting situation. While men and women can and do serve in combat roles, Israeli soldiers are conscripted for mandatory service compared to the volunteer system in the US, meaning there's a different social gap between civilian and soldier in terms of culture in Israel. Furthermore, while women-only combat units do exist, they are largely kept out of direct combat. Israel has experienced maximizing effectiveness by emphasizing more functional units in its active operations while shifting its less effective units to reserve. They are also loath to engage in long-term military campaigns because their professional manpower is a fraction of what larger countries like the US and the UK can muster. What I'm driving at here is that there are exceptions and processes in place to prevent a loss of functionality while simultaneously having a medical support system a trans person could access without the requirement of military service. The unit cohesion reports just aren't the same as the conditions in the US, and to rely on them would be unwise at best and dangerous at worst. Then there's the question of scale. While Canada does allow for transsexual soldiers to serve, only 1 sexual reassignment surgery was performed last year. In fact, the Israeli Defense Force doesn't even have an official report on how to officially process transsexuals either, and Australia doesn't publish its cost or number reports. In short, when it comes to unit cohesion in the US, no studies have been done. Should we risk the lives of those soldiers and their squad mates, or should we maybe look before we leap? It should also go without saying that I am in no way suggesting that transsexuals cannot be good soldiers. Quite the opposite, in fact. One of the reasons I exercised as hard as I did was to prove to all the doubters I had what it would take to be an excellent soldier. The reason I read Vietnam reports about McNamara, or Schwarzkopf's report of Desert Storm, or even Patton's tank manual, was so that I could be the excellent officer I knew I could be and prove it to other people. But the question here is one of cost in both blood and treasure. Based upon the research I've done, the military takes a direct hit in both function and resources by allowing trans people to join. Transsexual soldiers would be more expensive and have higher risks to themselves and their units. While I can appreciate the argument that a citizen-based army should be staffed by all demographics of the citizenry, some specific groups, like diabetics for example, are excluded because the cost to functionality is just too high. It was exploitative and wrong to our soldiers when we sent them to Iraq without proper body armor, and it would be just as exploitative and wrong to our soldiers to staff them with individuals that could not biologically perform the same duty. My belief throughout all of this is that I honor our soldiers' sacrifice and commitment too much to deprive them of further needed resources and to put them at risk with no reason. In 2012, the Army had about 570,000 soldiers. In 2015, it was down to 490,000, and just before Trump, it was scheduled to be reduced to 450,000 in 2018. Our manpower has been depleted in the disastrous conflicts with Iraq and Afghanistan, while President Obama slashed the budget by 15% for 4 years between 2011 and 2015. And then we have stories about the VA having people die before they could get service. Our soldiers deserve better. Why not take the same funds we'd spend retooling for transsexuals and use it as incentives to hire non-transsexual soldiers that wouldn't have the same medical and functional costs? Wouldn't that be more cost-effective? Sure, the military does waste money on frivolous expenses, but that should not be used as an excuse to knowingly put our fighting men and women at risk with fewer resources when we know more study needs to be done on this. No more dead soldiers, especially if we can avoid it. I know I'm likely not winning many points by presenting this argument, but my motivation is one out of admiration and duty to those who make the sacrifice of military service. If there were a compromise I might offer to President Trump, it would be to offer a second pathway for military service for transsexuals in the same way that we offer a second pathway for conscientious objectors or pacifists. Just as you can be given a position outside of combat if you're drafted as a pacifist, surely there has to be something similar we could do with transsexuals. And if the medical cost is too high for pre-op or transitioning soldiers, why not limit service to post-op individuals? Then take those individuals and have them serve in non-combat roles so more research can be done on cohesion. Regardless of what happens though, I think it would be an extreme disservice to the brave transsexual soldiers currently serving, and removing them through a ban would be an insult to their sacrifice. President Trump should tread very carefully in this regard, as many are already attributing to bigotry to what is better explained as a cost-benefit argument. This is President Trump's decision, and he will own all the good and all the bad that comes out of it. I know this video has gotten rather long, so thanks for listening, but there's one last thing I'd like to add. God bless each and every one of our soldiers in the armed forces. I, for one, am extremely thankful for the freedom and opportunity you and the United States afford me to pursue my sexuality without fear of persecution or death. Your struggle guarantees my freedom and safety and honors the commitment my grandfather made all those years ago. Nowhere on earth would I be as free and prosperous as I am as a transsexual in the United States. I am truly and deeply thankful for your service. God bless each and every one of you. This is Iron Liz, signing off. If you like the content of my podcasts, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe below. The bigger the audience I can spread the heresy toward, the better. You can also follow me on Twitter at Iron Liz. Once again, I'm Iron Liz, and thanks for listening.